Hello and welcome to Intercultural Studies. I'm Kalman Andrassy, and today we're going to be talking about cultural history and what it has to do with the study of culture and communication. So, ultimately, what does history have to do with culture and communication? Well, I think the answer can be found in a couple of quotes, okay? The first is from Marcus Garvey. A people without the knowledge of past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. Okay? David Crabtree said, our view of history shapes the way we view the present, and therefore it dictates what answers we offer for existing problems. Okay? And then Margaret Macmillan says, we use history to understand ourselves, and we ought to use it to understand others. All right? So, if you really sit down and think about it, the word culture can be substituted for the word history. History can provide insight into the values and the traditions and social institutions that a culture deems to be important. Okay? So, history is, one of the deep structures of the cultural fabric of any social system or broader civilization or society. Okay, so what I would like to do here is come to a little bit of a discussion of some of the major um, historical precedences that have influenced the development of the modern world. Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk about the ways that history has incorporated many different cultures, formal and informal government procedures, how it has incorporated its sense of community, as well as its political and its economic processes and realities, um, and also how it has incorporated its key historical heroes and really even its geography in shaping the way that societies have sort of developed. Okay, and with that, we're going to start with the United States of all places, with the idea here of just thinking about the ways in which history has kind of shaped the way that the United States has come to develop over the years. Okay, so if you really sit down and think about it, the United States' current national character can be traced all the way back to the European people who arrived in the early years of the nation's formation. Okay, so values that sort of continue to characterize the United States include concepts like hard work, self-improvement, practicality, of course, freedom, responsibility, the notion of equality, and perhaps chief among all, the notion of individuality. Okay? So these were essentially the values of many of the early settlers of the United States. Mostly a combination of selected English values, as well as a number of new beliefs, in particular the individuality component and the notion of self-improvement. Hmm. So as the American colonies began to work their way toward becoming the United States, there was sort of a shared desire of many of the first immigrants to this country to be free of, oppressive governmental regimes and the dictates of English institutions like the crown, or the notion of divine right to rule, as well as the Church of England that sort of motivated them to try to seek unity, right? Some of the initial individuals who came to the United States did so or rather, not the United States at the time, I should say, the colonies that became the United States, came to the United States to seek religious freedom apart from the Church of England, right? And so early Americans wanted essentially to ensure that they had certain inalienable rights. Okay? So there was that common desire to escape religious authoritarianism, There was the desire to escape monarchical rule. Um, and also, there was a bit of a rise to the notion of the separation of church and state as a result. So, individualism was perhaps then the most important among the initial values that began to emerge in the country. The idea that a person is free to believe whatever it is that they want to believe, religiously and otherwise, um, and to not be under the yoke of an authoritarian regime, right? So there was a significant distaste in the United States for this concept of formality, right? Wasting time um, was also not looked upon very well. So you saw the emergence of many social and religious movements that were centered around ensuring that individuals were doing the best that they could in order to reach whatever heights they could in their personal lives. Okay, which sort of brings us to today. Some of the contemporary social issues and elements of the culture right now include topics like immigration, right? Minorities now constitute the majority in many parts of the United States. And that is resulting in changes to the culture, which some individuals are resisting. Okay? Another topic is abortion rights, right? The notion of the right to life versus freedom of choice has become a major topic of discussion, and is probably going to be very central to um, uh, the election cycles that are going to be in place for the next decade or so, most likely. Okay. Also, the topic of same-sex marriage has become a significant topic of discussion. Again, um, with an emphasis on individual freedom, um, the right to same-sex marriage became part of the American system not all that long ago, and of course, that is going to be a topic of discussion, no doubt, for some time, um, as many members of society that might be opposed to that notion um, are having to sort of come to terms with that. Okay, moving on from the United States, which of course is the home country, if you will, of myself and the fact that this is being filmed in the United States. And we're going to move on to Russian history and talk about that in a little bit of detail as well. You know, Russia being a very strong influence on Europe and European politics, and really in the past, roughly about a good 100 years, you know, the place of Russia in the world has been um, a significant topic of discussion and something that is very important to sort of pay attention to. Okay, so you know the big element of Russia's history, what really sets Russia, I think, apart from a lot of different places in the world, is its geography. It is a very vast land. It is by far the largest country on planet Earth, right? It spans 11 different time zones and stretches across the entire northern tier of the European and Asian continent. So it is a very massive chunk of land, right? And what kept Russia safe to some extent in its history, but also was kind of a contributor to some of the problems that it may have had, was that it lacks any significant barriers to passage, which left the country vulnerable to historical invasions by armies, both from Europe as well as from Asia. But at the same time, the vastness of the country, um, you know, allowed it to be uh, a very difficult place to ultimately conquer. Okay, so you know, because of the fact that it was in many incidences invaded by other countries, Russians have sort of developed a perception of the world that frequently incorporates a bit of a sense of distrust, if you will, towards outsiders. So that kind of has also led to the way that Russia has conducted its affairs politically. So Russia's political heritage has sort of helped to mold the contemporary Russian worldview as well. Um, so, sort of a vivid example of this, the Russians were dominated by very harsh, very authoritarian rule. Um, and of course, the modern Russian state had its beginning in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution. The idea was that the Bolsheviks would overturn the oppressive Tsarist regime, um, eliminate the economic inequalities that were rampant in the country, and was intended to give the working class more of a political voice. But of course, as history has sort of shown us, the result was that much of the country um, I mean, for lack of a better word, was destroyed, and its entire socio-cultural structure was changed in the name of communism, right? Which was all about, in the case of Soviet communism, emphasizing state, agricultural, and industrial collectivism. Um, but was also accompanied by a large amount of deaths in political purges, right? We talk about the Nazi regime during World War II and the Holocaust and how many people were killed there. Surprisingly, even more people were killed in the Soviet political purges that came about after its formation. So that's something to kind of consider, and is really a fascinating part of Russian history. Okay. Another element of the modern Russian state is its deep appreciation of the Greek Orthodox Church and Orthodox Christianity. So this is something that's sort of predominated not only the social and political aspects of the country, but also is sort of central to Russian architecture, along with its music and its art, and of course, cultural arts are a very important part of Russian life. I mean, take a look at the image here of the Kremlin. Um, very, very fascinating architectural style here, very eye-catching, and things like that. Okay. Um, Now, fast forward, of course, to the late 80s and the early 90s, and Russia finds itself in a pretty significant amount of turmoil following the collapse of communism. Um, and you had an individual, a political strongman, kind of come in to fill the political void, and that individual was Vladimir Putin, who moved to consolidate and centralize political and economic power. So Putin asserted three distinct Russian values. First and foremost, Russian patriotism. Secondarily, the idea that the Russian state needs to play a role in the world's affairs. Um, and an emphasis on being centered on the state in Russia. Okay. And that sort of explains why Russia continues to move from more of a liberal democratic form of government towards more of an authoritarian sort of regime. All right. So, some of the major problems that are being seen in Russia today, official corruption has been a ongoing problem. Um, Declining population, birth rate has dropped very significantly in Russia, and there are significant concerns about that. Significant constraints on productivity and growth. Again, Russia kind of finds itself in an interesting situation where um, it has this former communist background, and that has significantly impacted parts of its industry. right? And then, of course, resentment and violence toward ethnic groups by many Russian nationalists. There have been ongoing conflicts in many parts of Russia as a result of those types of nationalistic tendencies. Okay, moving along, let's talk a little bit about Chinese history now. Okay, so China has a very, very long record of achievements and experiences that have sort of formed an important part of how today's 1.3 or so billion contemporary Chinese individuals perceive and experience the world. So archaeological data suggests that Chinese history goes back perhaps as far as 9,000 years ago to 7,000 years before the Common Era. Um, so, again, just like with Russia, geography has really played a significant role in China's pretty uninterrupted record of cultural development. Okay. Um, so as far as historical perspectives and things like that, whereas Russia has its religious preference for the Greek Orthodox Church, China's worldview is influenced significantly by Confucianism, right? And it's something of a state ideology um, that has led to the facilitation and consolidation of control under a centralized ruler in China throughout most of its history. Okay. And, fast forward to modern Chinese history. Since 1949, China has been governed by the Chinese Communist Party. Um, and so we start with the early years of the CCP and its rule, um, particularly under Mao Zedong. It's characterized by internal strife and a lot of political turmoil. But of course, post-war communist leaders, they wanted to kind of establish their mark on the country, and they initiated a series of significant reform programs, including the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, which unfortunately had a very negative impact on China, very disastrous effects on the nation and its populace. Um, Professor de Koetter estimates that the Great Leap experiment from, again, 1958 to about 1962 may have resulted in the premature deaths of as many as 45 million people in China, right? So not necessarily the best part about Chinese history there. So in the early 1970s, China began to move away from these sort of revolutionary programs and responded rather positively to some political overtures from the United States. Um, and by the 1990s, Chinese leaders had opted for what is ultimately a fairly market-driven economy, right? It would almost be a misnomer to say that China, governed by the Chinese Communist Party, is really a reflection of communism as it has historically been known to be. And of course, this has proven to be very, very successful and improved the lives of millions of China's citizens. In 2010, China became the second largest economy in the world, following the United States, and has been the leading country for exports in the world. So China has seen some significant growth and improvement in the recent years. Okay. Now, that being said, Chinese society has traditionally predominantly been an agricultural society, and the people living within China have sort of maintained pretty strong ties with their home villages and their homelands. Um, so, in addition to that, um, two of the central values in Chinese society are, the notion of the patriarchal family or clan as the basis of most social units in society, and the acceptance of centralized patrimonial governance. So that's kind of influenced the way China has developed. So China also offers us an example of how governments can use history as a form of communication to promote nationalism and foreign policy ideas as well. Okay, so where does China find itself today in terms of its contemporary issues? Well, like Russia, there is pretty widespread official corruption found in many of the localities in China. And there's a growing sense of social inequality between the rich and the poor. China is beginning to see the emergence of billionaires within its society, all while other parts of society are existing on mere dollars a day to get by. Of course, there's rising unemployment in some of the urban areas that's leading to a lot of social problems. And of course, the changing structure and the location of the Chinese population is really beginning to shape where it's kind of going in terms of its cultural development in the foreseeable future. Um, there's also a cultural imperative for sons that combined with the availability of selective abortion, have led to some demographic shifts and changes in the last couple of decades. And China had an official one-child policy in place that was put in place about 30 years ago or so. That's resulted in, of course, a disproportionate number of males being born among the younger generations. So that's going to be something that's going to affect China and its development in the years to come. Next up, we have Japan. And of course, as with, really it could be said that many of these countries, are a product of geography. I think the United States is no less a product of its geography, given that it has basically two oceans between it and Europe, as well as between it and Asia. Um, so really, the history of Japan, like I said, is going to be a product of its geography because it is an island nation, right? There's 100 miles of ocean between it and the Korean Peninsula, and China's about 500 miles across the Yellow Sea to the west of Japan. Okay, um, so again, Japanese history goes back many, many millennia as well. Um, but Confucianism and Buddhism entered Japan, brought from China through Korea, which exerted a significant and enduring influence on the development of Japanese society. Um, so it's a relatively small nation if you really come to think about it. It's comprised of four major islands and about several thousand smaller ones. Um, and really, it was only accessible by sea until basically the earlier part of the 20th century. Um, so that gave Japan this option to try to be more insular. Um, and it rejected a lot of foreign trade, and it was fairly immune to large scale immigration from the Asian mainland. So it kind of developed this almost isolationist perspective that influenced the country for centuries, basically. Okay. Invading foreign armies were usually stymied by the sea as well. Um, and not only was there natural isolation, but for 250 years, the government imposed national seclusion during the Tokugawa or Edo era between about 1603 and 1867. Okay. And that, of course, was instrumental in Japan's cultural distinctiveness and its self-image as well. So again, we have historical isolation, low numbers of immigrants, and a feudal-based society and system of governments that produced a society that was characterized largely by its relative cultural homogeneity, meaning that uh, Japanese culture was seen as very integrated and singular. That's not to say that there aren't ethnic minorities in Japan, such as the Ainu people, um, but the idea was that um, there is sort of a singular political and social system that pervades Japan again for many, many centuries. So, one expression of cultural homogeneity in Japan is its perspective and attitude toward foreigners. um, so while their culture specifies sort of appropriate behavior for working with and socializing with other Japanese individuals, it doesn't really have any established correct way of dealing with foreigners that has evolved. Um, and so there is sort of a degree of uncertainty in Japanese society toward foreigners that persists to this day. And again, as is evident in its contemporary attitudes towards immigration, which again is very, very strictly controlled. Um, so, as far as the central government in Japan is concerned, it specifies very strict codes of behavior to regulate the conduct of every aspect of personal and public life since the Tokugawa era. Um, and so the Japanese formed a culture in which many contexts there was really only a single correct way to perform a task. And the notion of mastering that one way of um, behaving or of doing something became central to the Japanese way of life. Okay? So the objective of these protocols was ultimately to ensure that there's a degree of external peace and an internal group stability by again subordinating the individual to the central authority and to the greater social order. Okay? So societal stability became kind of the paramount objective in Japan. And this continues to be the central focus of Japanese social actions today. Okay? So modern corporations and government institutions kind of became substitutes for the castle towns that emerged throughout Japanese history, um, and have traditionally kind of offered this notion of lifetime employment, right? The idea of marrying the corporation that you're working with has sort of been central to the Japanese way of life in modern times. Feudalism also inculcated the Japanese um, sort of an acceptance of discipline and of sacrifice and, of course, of conformity. So people were required to conduct every aspect of their life in a highly prescribed manner. And that was, of course, depending on their social class membership that dictated the way that they were expected to behave. So conditions have been, translated into contemporary Japanese dedication to societal and organizational formality as well today, an acceptance of high authority and status differentials and things like that, as well as conformity to group expectations. Okay, so due to the necessity of group cooperation in early Japanese village life, exclusion or the threat thereof became a form of punishment in Japan. So group orientation continues to guide the contemporary Japanese society, um, where status is based more on the schools attended or your profession or your employer, more so than individual achievements and things like that. Okay? Now, contemporary social issues in Japan, right? So based on its history, it kind of makes sense that, demographic changes are a big part of the concern of the social life in Japan. Immigration issues, again, another uh, thing that is potentially opening the door to culture clashes in the future. And then, of course, risk management as well. Japan is a place that is very seismically active. It is not uncommon to be hit by significant storms. Um, so there are a lot of issues that Japan has to deal with as far as its geography is concerned as well. Okay. Next up, let's talk a little bit about Indian history. Um, and really, I think what sets India apart is that diversity really characterizes the geography and the people and the cultures and the languages, I should say, plural, because there's many different languages spoken in India, and of course the history of India as well. So it's sort of a product of influences from South and Northeast Asia, Central Asia to a large extent, as well as the Middle East and Europe. So really the archaeological record indicates that there were hunter-gatherers on the Indian subcontinent. Um, whether they were Homo sapiens or not is a topic of concern. But as early as 2 million years ago, there may have been people living in the Indian subcontinent. So that's kind of a fascinating thing. Um, about 4,000 or so years ago, you had the arrival of the nomadic Aryan people coming from the West. Um, and they brought with them a lot of different technological and other advances of the time, not the least of which was the domestication of cattle, as well as horses. And these Aryan peoples conquered and settled most of what is today northern India, and established a number of different warring principalities as a result. Um, Alexander the Great of Macedonia crossed into India in 327 BCE, and he found a politically and territorially divided land that was highly vulnerable to conquest. Once Alexander departed, most of the subcontinent was consolidated into the Mauryan Empire, uh, ranging from basically 321 to 185 BCE, which was India's first real unified state. Um, the Mauryan culture began to decline and it left India fairly politically fragmented until the second unification of northern India under the Gupta dynasty, which basically um, went again and unified northern India. And during these two eras, both the Mauryan and the Gupta dynasties, Buddhism and Hinduism really rose and flourished in India, and rulers practiced religious tolerance, which became one of India's primary principles. Okay, and Hinduism sort of provided a unifying framework for that perspective. Fast forward to about 711 in the Common Era, Islam first arrived, basically in the southern part of present-day Pakistan. Um, but its influence began as relatively contained to that region. Um, Later on, Muslim invaders arriving from the west through the Khyber Pass established sort of an enduring presence on the Indian subcontinent. And raiders set about trying to conquer Hindus and destroying their temples. That led to the beginnings of a schism in those principles of religious tolerance, and resulted in some degree of communal hatred in the hearts and minds of the Indian populace. Um, Fast forward to about 1526, you see a new wave of Muslim invaders, um, and Mongols from Central Asia came and established the Mughal Empire. which was sort of the strongest dynasty in Indian history and nominally held power until all the way in the 1800s, basically the mid 1800s. Um, and that led to the flourishment and significant development of Indian culture. A civil service was established to administer the country. Religious and ethnic differences were tolerated. Meritocracy was practiced. Um, Persian became the official language and that of the court. And the arts were by and large encouraged and thrived. So of course you see the picture of the Taj Mahal there. It was a monument to the wife of one of the Mughal rulers and was built during this Mughal period, right? Um, the decline of Mughal rule is what ultimately opened the door for the Western powers to kind of step in. The development of sea power, um, you know, led to the Western Europeans being able to circumvent the overland route, sailing around the Horn of Africa to reach the Indian Ocean and its littoral lands. Portuguese ships arrived in West India in about 1510. And of course, England's East India Company gained power through military takeover and established itself as a dominant trader in India until about 1813. Okay. Um, in 1885, the Indian National Congress was established to address the excesses of British colonial rule. And it was largely ineffective until you had an individual named Mohandas Gandhi, um, able to build a very effective coalition, and he earned the title of Mahatma, um, which led to, of course, India's independence from British rule in 1847. Um, and the big issue there was that there was long-standing discord between the Hindus and the Muslims. Um, and Gandhi basically begged and pleaded with the British not to split apart the Indian subcontinent along religious grounds, but they did so anyway, and that led to India being partitioned into two separate sovereign states, India and Pakistan. And initially there was both a West and an East Pakistan. Eventually, East Pakistan became Bangladesh. Okay. But anyway, that partitioning of the territory displaced about 10 million people, and it led to very widespread political violence between Hindus and Muslims. Um, and it led to the loss of as many as 1 million lives. So, very, very catastrophic was this partitioning of the territory. And of course, the enduring conflict between India and Pakistan over the Kashmir region is sort of a legacy of that partition. Okay. Now, fast forward um, in the 20th century, India instituted a government-controlled, fairly socialist-oriented economy. Um, it had very marginal growth, not very much growth, significant budget deficits, a fairly bloated bureaucracy, and very high levels of unemployment. And by the 1990s, it took until then to establish some significant economic reforms that were kind of undertaken and gave rise the to India's status in the global economy. So benefits derived from this economic growth. Um, I don't know, there's sort of a divide. It's kind of felt disproportionately among the population. Um, Most of the population remains predominantly rural and very poor and oftentimes illiterate, whereas the cities have kind of benefited from that growth. Of course, the digital age is bringing significant cultural change to Indian society as well. The digital revolution is also beginning to change some Indian courtship practices and things like that. It's enabled young couples to communicate via email, social networking sites, and with their mobile phones and things like that. So it's kind of an interesting way that the culture is being changed in that regard. Now it's contemporary social issues. Again, we have extensive, persistent poverty in India, and that's going to be a major uh, cause for concern in much of India. Of course, there's widespread official corruption as well, and a lack of adequate primary school education in many of the Indian states, unfortunately. And of course, there is that long-standing schism between Muslim and Hindu, um, and uh, and the potential for more conflicts to arise from that. So next up, our neighbor to the south here in the United States, um, Mexico, and the idea of Mexican history. Here is the Zocalo um, Square in Mexico City. Um, so to understand Mexican history, you have to go to, the pre-Columbian era, and then kind of distinguish that from the invasion of the country by Spain in the 1500s. So um, prior to the arrival of Europeans in Mexico, um, you had mostly agriculturally based societies in the Olmec people, the Maya, the Tolmecs, and the Aztec people. And each of these societies established significant empires, which made unique contributions to modern Mexican culture. And really, most Mexicans are very proud of this period in their history, not only for achievements in agriculture, as well as the creative arts, but also the establishment of large urban settlements, as well as scientific advancements. In many regards, the Mexican empires prior to the arrival of the Europeans were more technologically advanced than many of the cities in Europe, which is kind of fascinating, right? And then we had the invasion by Spain. So it brought an end to the pre-Columbian period in roughly about 1519. And Spanish occupation kind of changed the country and its people pretty much forever up until today. So first and foremost, chief among that was the introduction of Catholicism, and the development of a very rigid social class system. Um, and granting large amounts of land to the Spanish conquerors, putting them into power, and establishing an aristocracy that dominated a population, again, of primarily agrarian peasants under what was referred to as the hacienda system. Okay? Um, it took until 1821 for Mexico to gain independence from Spain, when Spain and Mexico negotiated a treaty called the uh, Plan of Iguala, sometimes referred to as the Plan of Three Guarantees. Final freedom came in 1824 when Mexico became a federal republic with its own constitution. Um, but neither independence from Spain or the Mexican Revolution really changed the basic structure of the social relations, in which there was a small and largely Hispanic elite in Mexico. Okay? Um, which brings us to 1846, when you had the start of the Mexican-American War, which was a pivotal part in both Mexican and U.S. History. So the territory of Texas was part of Mexican rule, um, but with the arrival of settlers from um, various parts of the United States and its territories, eventually, Texas declared itself an independent country. Okay? Um, and due in large part to the United States doctrine of manifest destiny, um, it was a large part of the reason that the Mexican-American War started in May 13th of 1846. So you had President James K. Polk, with the backing of the American people, seeking to acquire basically what amounted to about half of Mexico's territory at the time. So the two countries fought a war over the land for about 2 years, from about 1846 to 1848. A war that is seldom remembered in the United States, but uh, Mexico considers to be one of its greatest disasters. So, with that, Polk was able to seize all the way to Mexico City, interestingly enough. It did wind up settling on dividing the territory that it acquired with the Rio Grande River, and giving back a lot of that territory. But the war was ended on February 2nd, 1848, with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Fast forward to 1910, and Mexican. Well, let's provide some context first. So, at that time, about 90% of Mexico's mestizos, or mixed individuals, and native population were still desperately poor, working on the ranches and the haciendas of a handful of very, very, very wealthy landowners. Um, and so the revolution of 1910 was a time that ushered in widespread social change. It rejected the European system as the model of governance in Mexico, and it really asserted the native people's identity as central to what Mexico is. And so the revolution committed the government to providing security for the peasants and the workers by redistributing land and income, which leads to our modern Mexico today, which has discovered fairly significant oil and natural gas reserves. And it has allowed Mexico, since the revolution, to establish manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, hundreds of maquiladora factories along the US-Mexico border. Now, this has made Mexico a pretty significant economic force in recent times. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was passed. That included Mexico, the United States, and Canada, and they became free trade partners with no barriers to trade and tariffs and things like that. But of course, there are still some pretty critical issues between the United States and Mexico, which are probably going to require some degree of intercultural interaction. Okay? So Mexico's contemporary social issues include, of course, poverty. Unemployment is a major concern. And Mexico has become sort of a hub of the smuggling of illegal substances, which has led to the establishment of major drug cartels throughout vast swaths of the country. Okay? And these are all things that Mexico is hoping to deal with probably in the nearer future. Which leads us to the last topic of discussion, because it sort of encompasses a wide range of different nations, the history of Islamic civilization. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about Muslim demographics. Muslims represent the majority population in 49 countries around the world. And there are growing populations of Muslims in Europe as well as North America. There are about 1.6 billion Muslims in the world, about 1/5 of the entire world population, second only to Christianity in terms of religious influence in the world, right? So these numbers are expected to grow between now and about 2030, before leveling off at up to about 2.1 billion Muslims in the world. Okay, so let's go into the history of Islam, and we have to start with the age predating Islam, the pre-Islamic age, referred to often by Muslims as the age of ignorance. So early Arabs composed poems that really embodied their code of values, which included things like bravery in battle, patience in the face of misfortune, persistence in getting revenge, protection of the weak, defiance of the strong, loyalty to the tribe, hospitality to the guest, generosity to the needy, and fidelity in carrying out promises. So loyalty to one's tribe was paramount, and intertribal wars and raids against caravan routes and things like that were fairly common during this period. And of course, early groups practiced a wide variety of religions, including Judaism, Christianity, animism, as well as ancestor worship. Um, and and a tradition developed among the tribes to annually suspend hostilities and conduct a pilgrimage to the ancient shrine in the city of Mecca. Okay. And then, of course, in 610, in the Common Era, um, you saw the rise of Muhammad, who was from a merchant family in Mecca. Um, and as the Quran states, he received heavenly revelations, not revolutions, revelations, and began to recruit followers. Again, in the early 600s. Um, and there was a significant rise and spread of Islam that began with his death in 632 of the Common Era, which led to no clear line of succession for Islamic leadership after Muhammad had died. And the void there was filled by a series of caliphs, which is the Arabic word for roughly successor or representative. Um, and the role was assumed by successive leaders of Islam, basically until the demise of the Ottoman Empire all the way in 1923. Okay, so the first caliphs were drawn from those who had directly served Muhammad. They were known as the Patriarchal Caliphate. Um, Many of the Arab groups that had previously submitted to his teachings and leadership sought to dissociate themselves from the new caliphs. Um, and so armed groups of believers were dispatched to sort of suppress the dissenters, and it led to the first great schism in Islam between the Sunni and the Shia people. So the Sunni people believe that the leader of Islam should be whoever is the best qualified for that position, whereas the Shiites contend that the leadership must be a function of heredity through lineage that is traced through the succession of Muhammad. Okay? And originally, the two groups saw themselves as divided, not necessarily by ideology, but by a question of politics. And over time, varied theological and religious practices began to evolve in these divided groups. Okay? In the mid 8th century, you saw the Umayyad Caliphate, succeeded by the Abbasid Caliphate. That was basically around until about 1258. And the seat of government was moved to Baghdad in modern day Iraq. The early years of the 11th century saw the onset of significant clashes between Christianity and Islam, with the Crusades that lasted almost 200 years. So, as Islam was beginning to encroach on European lands, many of the European Christian rulers took up arms to reclaim those territories, and eventually to reclaim Jerusalem in particular from Islamic control, given the significance of the state of Israel and the cities of Jerusalem and surrounding areas to Christianity, as well as to Judaism and Islam. Okay. The final era of unified Islamic governance was brought about by the Mongol invaders coming from Central Asia through Afghanistan and Persia into the Middle East. Um, and really, the defeat of the Ottoman Empire at the end of the First World War really concluded more than 13 centuries of a unified Islamic rule, and it replaced um, the Islamic empires with nation states, many of which, again, remained under the domination of Western colonial powers until roughly the end of World War II or thereafter. Okay. So as far as that's concerned, the history and the worldview of Muslims, Islamic history for Muslims has an important religious as well as a legal significance since it reflects the working out of God's purpose for his community, um, and those that accept the teachings of Islam and obey its law, right? So the history of Islam is continually reinforced through things like language, geography, and of course, tribal affiliations. Now, that all being said, there are a lot of social changes taking place in much of the Islamic world, and that's leading to some contemporary social issues. Of course, there are some authoritative and repressive regimes in control in many parts of the Islamic world. This has led to um, many, many uprisings, and in some cases, the overthrow of governments in parts of the Islamic world, um, particularly through the Arab Spring, um, which took place a little over a decade ago now. Of course, official corruption is a problem in many of the countries as well. Um, there's virtually no viable democratic processes in a lot of different Islamic countries, and very stagnant economic development in kind. A lot of lack of women's equality, which is being pushed against in some places. And of course, there is an expanding population, a majority of which are individuals that are under 25 years old and really see very little opportunity for economic advancement, which is, leading to very, very significant issues and strife in a lot of countries. And if one were to make predictions, that's going to come to a significant head. The longer these conditions sort of persist. And, you know, uh, further revolutions, not unlike the Arab Spring, might be seen in many other parts of the Islamic world in the years to come. Okay, so that kind of runs the gamut of the histories of some of the most significant powers, um, really that influence and affect the United States as well as um, world relations and things like that, and of course intercultural communication, and being able to relate to individuals of these varying and differing cultures with varying historical backgrounds is going to be central to ensuring peace and stability as the world moves into the future. So that all being said, a big part of intercultural studies is to study the histories of those cultures with which you're going to interact to try to understand what makes people behave the way that they do under the circumstances that they find themselves under. So with that, have a fantastic day, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.